women, they kind of plan their life around a big day, which is kind of their wedding day. And maybe that's true for a lot of women, I don't know. But he said, but men, he said, they are always planning for their funeral. And I said, well, that's kind of a weird thing. What do you mean they're always planning for their funeral? And he said, well, they want to know, they want to plan their life over what is going to be said about them. The final thing that is going to be said about their legacy at their funeral. And what he said really actually makes sense. Now, roughly, I don't know, it was about 15 years ago or so, there was something that was on the front page of the Newark Advocate. And again, I don't know why I remember this or why I know it. I've been told that I'm a wealth of useless information, but I can say that sometimes that useless information does make good sermon illustrations. But again, it was like roughly 15, 16 years ago. On the front page of the Advocate, there was this story that caught my attention, and I still remember it to this day. So as I'm reading the story, it says there was this man, he lived in a house on Church Street in Newark, and he was doing some work on his foundation in his basement. And as he removed one of the blocks out of the wall from the basement, a human skull fell out of the dirt onto the floor in front of him. So this man starts thinking to himself, oh wow, I've just discovered a murder. I need to, this is probably an old murder, obviously, because it's a skull, but I've discovered something. I need to call the police and get them down here and find out what's going on. And so he calls the police, and they come and they do an investigation. And as it turned out, back in the early to mid 1800s, that land was owned by a couple, and that couple wanted to turn it into a cemetery. That's where they wanted to donate it to Newark as a cemetery. And so in their will, when they died, they left specific legal instructions that this land would go to Newark only if Newark would promise that this land would be a cemetery. And so the land right there, and this part I don't remember. I don't remember which part of Church Street it is, in case you're wondering. But some section of Church Street was some cemetery back in the 1800s. Now Newark, around that time, started to expand. And they were growing, and real estate was very valuable in the Church Street area. And so Newark got a little greedy, and they decided that it should no longer be a cemetery, but that it should be developed, and that houses should be put there, and that people should move in. So because it was in the will that, this land was only supposed to be to Newark if they kept it as a cemetery, Newark had to actually take this. I believe the article said it went up to the state Supreme Court, and the state Supreme Court actually gave them permission. But the thing is, they never moved the bodies. So they just put in this development. They took out the tombstones, and they built these houses. And again, in case you're wondering, if anybody's into real estate in Newark, someplace in Church Street, there might be a body in your basement because there's this old cemetery that's just sitting there with these forgotten people. But the point of what I'm saying is how many of you think anybody who was buried there in that cemetery would have ever thought that would have happened to them in the future? Now, they're dead and gone, obviously. But when we think about dying, we kind of think about setting up our legacy. Many times we'll even think about what we want the epitaph to be on our tombstone. And many people will come up with a funny one to maybe entertain people. I think Benjamin Franklin says, "Here lies Benjamin Franklin, food for worms," something of that effect, in Philadelphia. But we put messages on there because we're trying to propagate our legacy. But these people, they could have never known that in the future they would have been completely forgotten about. And all those people, every last one of them who made up the city of Newark back in the mid-1800s or the early 1800s, the good and the bad people, the doctors, the pastors, the lawyers, the plant workers, the clerks, the politicians, even the drunks, the philosophers, the mothers, the fathers, the grandparents, the sons and the daughters, all of them forgotten by the Newark that now is. And they're only talked about today, not because we're holding on to their living legacy like it's something special, but because one of their skulls happened to fall into somebody's basement when they were doing work. So it's a great modern day analogy of the ancient proclamation of King Solomon in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 16, where he said, "For of the wise man, even as of the fool, there is no memory forever. Since in the days to come, all will have been long forgotten. Indeed, the wise man must die just like the fool." and we forget them all. It doesn't matter. But yet humanity continues to struggle. This is what gets me about this. We continue to struggle to preserve our legacy in this life, ignoring the fact that it never works and that it will eventually always pass away. Yeah, some people, their memory stays around a little bit longer than others, but eventually time erases everything. And civilization is built around this, about man and woman trying to build their legacy. And they call it survival of the fittest. That's what we try and do. We try to be the fittest. We try to be the one whose name will be spoken of. And man passes out awards and we pass out trophies to each other just like there's some great eternal honor that are never going to diminish with time. Now in that video, it really spoke to me because as you're hearing them sing about whether you're having your own legacy or whether you're choosing a legacy in Christ, it's showing all of these different trophies. And you could, if you were actually looking close at the video, you could see many of these trophies are dating back. These people are long gone. But all of these trophies representing these great accomplishments in people's lives. And it actually got me thinking about something that happened at the library not that long ago. So back, I don't know if anybody here remembers the name Bill Simmons, who was kind of big around Utica. Well, I'm sure any teachers that worked there would remember him. So back years ago, the school was wanting to get rid of some trophies that they had all around the school because they were running out of space. And so they had all these trophies, and some of them, I looked at them, dated all the way back to like the 30s, and they went through, I think, all the way up until maybe the 80s. And so they decided that they didn't have room for these trophies anymore, and plus there was nobody around that remembered many of these people. But Bill didn't want to throw them away, so he asked Hervey Memorial Library in Utica if they would take the trophies. So the library took them and they kind of displayed them as kind of a local historical thing and put them all up around everywhere. Well, just a couple of months ago, when they decided to do the refresh, a new person, who's a manager for the library now, came in and said, "What are these things doing here? And there is no reason why we need these." And guess where those trophies are now? They're in the dumpster. They're gone. Because I contacted the school and I said, "Hey, we've got all these trophies and the library says they want to throw them out. Do you want them?" And I never even got a response back from the school. So they're all gone. This proud legacy, forgotten, but intentionally thrown out, because that's what we do. How many people have you talked to that could care less about history? They only care about current because they're thinking about themselves and their own legacy. So we throw history away. Now I know a teenager, he actually belongs to the youth group where he at least comes every now so often, and he doesn't believe in God. And I asked him once, we were having a conversation, I think it was here at the church, but it was just him and I asked him once how he felt about the fact that he was going to die one day. Because I wanted him to be confronted with that fact and see if he had ever given it any consideration. The surprising thing to me about his response was that he had actually given that subject quite a bit of thought. And he was really not that bothered at all by the prospect of dying itself. Since he didn't believe in heaven or hell, dying didn't really matter to him or scare him. So the image of just not existing anymore, or maybe like an eternal sleep or something like that, was kind of easy for him to swallow. And he was okay with it. So I thought, how do you speak to somebody that's okay with the fact that they're going to die someday and they don't blame? But after I listened to his response, I decided I was going to ask him another question. Because I also wanted to know how he felt about the fact that alongside of his physical death, that also the memory of his entire existence was one day going to be wiped out for all of eternity. No one else was ever going to remember his name. It was going to be gone. And I wanted him to be confronted with the reality that this day was coming, where there's going to be no one left on this planet who would know that he ever even existed. And the interesting thing that I found coming from this angle was that this question about his legacy disappearing, not the one about his death, but the one about his legacy disappearing, actually made him a little bit combative. Made him talk a little bit more about it, made him a little upset, because this particular young man, he has all sorts of dreams for making a name for himself in this world through music. He's very much into music, and he thinks he's going to create this unforgettable name and that his music is going to be really big someday. And so I started to explain to him how eventually everything, no matter how big it is forgotten. Yet he would continue to argue with me how he was going to be remembered through his music anyways. He said, music transcends. We've got all this music from these ancient times that have still been passed on. Names will be remembered. So I decided to take it to his level then. And I said, okay, well, let's use the there is no God approach, since that's where you're at. You don't believe there's a God. And I told him, so even in pure atheistic science, it dictates to us that someday the sun is going to burn itself out of hydrogen. We've all heard it. That's what science tells us. That the sun, and they say it's already, I think, halfway out of hydrogen. Now, it'll be like 1 billion years or something like that, but it's eventually going to run out of hydrogen. And then what's going to happen is it's going to implode, and it's going to create a black hole. And they say that it's going to destroy our entire solar system, as it'll suck all of the planets in and anything that comes near to it, erasing not only the memory of Him, but everyone else who's ever existed right along with it. And you know what he said back to me? It's kind of funny, actually. He said, well, by the time that happens, humans will have colonized another planet, and they will have brought my music there, so my legacy will continue to live on. And that is how he comforted himself when faced with the facts that eventually his legacy was going to be gone. You see, he refused to acknowledge even the possibility that whatever legacy he creates for himself down here on earth is one day going to be gone forever, because his music legacy is what he is hungering for. That's what he's thirsting for. It's what he thinks about. So physical death itself doesn't scare him. It doesn't even bother him a little bit. But eternal death of his name terrifies him so much that he would search for any hope and any ridiculous scheme possible to think about preserving his legacy that will eventually slip through his fingers like sand, like it does to all of the rest of us. Now, who knows? This young man, he might eventually make it big someday. I'm sure he's very talented, and from what I've seen, he is. But even if he does, again, like the rest of us, he's going to end up forgotten. And just like those lonely, nameless corpses, we don't even know who they are, resting in basements on Church Street in Newark. They were forgotten. No one in Newark today remembers who those people are. Now, all through history, man has futilely tried to build his legacy in much the same way, even to the extent of erecting great monuments. I kind of mentioned a monument that was erected by the children of Israel that God told them to erect. But we can see it all through history. We see the pyramids. We see Stonehenge. We see the Great Colosseum and many different things like this. And even now they've lasted for quite some time, I'll give you that. But even they are beginning to crumble and will one day be gone. But you know what that proves? What it proves is that we are collectively, like I said, hungry and thirsty for something. You see, in the Beatitude that I read this morning, Christ Jesus said, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled." But the question today is not whether or not we are hungry or thirsty. In the first place, because we understand that we are. That is a natural part of the physical and also the spiritual body, or the physical body and the spiritual nature of us. Now, my point to you in all that I've said this morning is that our desire for our own legacy proves to us that we are hungering and thirsting for some sort of spiritual meaning in this life, and that is the spiritual hunger, just like we all know what physical hunger is. Now, you see, we don't have mind control over our physical hunger. It's automatic. We all know how it works. Okay, so this morning I didn't eat anything when I got up this morning because my stomach was a little bit upset. Now, if I go on today and I choose not to eat anything for lunch, even though I'm starting to feel better, by the time dinner rolls around, my stomach is really going to tell me that I'm hungry and that I need to eat something. Most likely it's going to happen by lunchtime, since I haven't eaten anything yet this morning. I don't have any control over that. The only control I have over that feeling is when I feel it, to start to eat something so that it'll be satisfied. Now, we can control our physical hunger that way. Like I said, we can satisfy it and we can fill it with something. And spiritual hunger is the same thing. We are all hungry for something because it's how God made us. He made the body and He made the spirit, and He made them very similar, just in different aspects. Now again, we don't have any control over that hunger either. It's there. The only thing that we can do about it is try to ignore it or try to fill it with something. So the real question that we need to ask ourselves this morning is, what are we feeding that hunger with? What are we drinking to satisfy that thirst? Something temporary or something eternal? You know, I've learned a lot about foods since being on this keto diet. And again, it's given me another sermon illustration, so it's worth it at least for that. And one thing that I've learned on this diet is that when you eat carbs, it causes you to be more hungry for carbs. It causes your hunger to actually increase. And you kind of increases for those bad things that you're not supposed to have. And you start to crave them and you want them. Now, I told you all before in a sermon a few weeks ago that I used to slam Oreo cookies. And I could put down a lot of Oreo cookies if I wanted to. And the thing is I was never satisfied with the amount that I was eating. That's why I would continue to eat them. And that's why I continued to get bigger and bigger, because I enjoyed Oreo cookies and I continued to crave them and I would continue to eat them. Now, off of carbs, I noticed that my hunger started to subside. So not only was I eating more of the right things, once those initial cravings, now when you're on this diet for a while, the first few weeks are a little rough, but once you get off of it for a while and you start eating the right things, you start feeling less and less hungry and you feel more satisfied when you do eat something that is good. And Shelley accidentally came across this a few weeks ago because she was making peanut butter and jelly sandwiches for the kids, or maybe it was lunch meat sandwiches, but she was making sandwiches for the kids. And she was in a hurry, and she was asking them if they wanted a half or a whole, and when it was all said and done, there was one half piece that was left. And she said, I was just in a hurry, so I started eating it, and she got half of it eaten before she realized she was eating bread. And she's like, oh no, this is not part of the diet, that I'm supposed to do. So she stopped, but then she told me how hungry she felt the rest of that day. She said, I can't believe it, they're right. When you just get a little bit of carbs when you haven't had any, you sit there and you hunger for it for the rest of the day. I feel so hungry right now. But here's the fanatical thing about the whole diet that I'm talking about. And again, I'm using an analogy here, but I'm speaking of something spiritual. But now that I'm off of carbs, when I'm hungry, I crave Brussels sprouts. Now that's crazy, isn't it? But I actually enjoy the taste of Brussels sprouts. Now wait, there's actually something even crazier than that. In addition to craving them, they also will fill me up. And they're good for me. I mean, there's been a couple of times where Shelley's asked what I want for dinner while I'm at work, and I said, just make me a small little thing of Brussels sprouts. That's all I want when I get home. And it's actually something that I'm craving, and then it fills me up. Now, that never would have been the case a few months ago. But the same is true for our spiritual hunger and our spiritual thirst. Now, we can spend our lives trying to fill ourselves with this world's version of success, that what we think tastes good, so to speak. And we can go ahead and we can build our own legacy off of those things. But I can guarantee you that not only will your legacy eventually be forgotten, but that it will also never truly satisfy you while you are here. You will continue to hunger. You will never feel satisfied. Now let's just look at just a couple of examples, or a few examples here, of people who should have been satisfied by the worldly standards of success. In 2017, there was a man named Chester Bennington who was a model of success. He was a member of the popular music group Linkin Park, and he hung himself. In 2018, a woman named Stephanie Adams, who was a former American glamour model, very successful in what she did. She was also the November 1992 Playboy Playmate, jumped from her 25th floor window after pushing out her 7-year-old son first. In 2011, American skier and Olympic medalist Jarrett Speedy Peterson shot and killed himself to death. And it was said that millionaire Howard Hughes spent months of his life in a darkened screening room without bathing and relieving himself in bottles while subsisting on a diet of chocolate bars, chicken, and milk. And then he died in 1976, shriveled and unkempt. And here's the thing that I didn't know until recently, but this really shocked me. Fingerprints were actually required to positively identify this man's body. You see, these people, they were what we would say are success, millionaires. People who have it all together, who have everything they could possibly want in this life. But guess what? They were very broken people. And a broken world can offer no assistance in fixing us. You see, everything in this life, spiritually speaking, is just as empty as those carbs that I was speaking on. They feel great while you're consuming them, but then they leave you desiring more and more, and they never fill you up. And they cause you to get depressed. But Jesus said, I am the bread of life. He that cometh to me shall never hunger, and he that believeth on me shall never thirst. And he told the woman at the well that whoever drinks of the water that I will give him will never thirst again. But the water that I will give him will become in him a well of water springing up to eternal life. You see, Christ is telling us in this beatitude, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. He's telling us to spiritually choose what we are going to crave and fill ourselves with. He is telling us not to be hungry for the empty things of this life that leave us worse off than we were before, but to feast upon and share in His eternal legacy of righteousness that will never pass away. Now, I can't think of a better analogy to give than an example set before me this week by a little child. You all know we've been watching these 3 extra kids. We have custody of them. And anytime there's a situation like that, there's going to be some emotional issues. And when we decided that we were going to do this, we set Abigail and Josiah down and we talked with them and we said, look, this is a great opportunity. I said, I know you guys might be jealous. You're not going to have quite as much time with us because we've got to share it with everyone. You might have to share your toys. You're going to have to share your bedrooms. I said, but listen, I've told you guys since you were just little babies, as soon as you could start understanding that we need to show Jesus Christ to this world. And I said, this is a perfect opportunity for you guys to show Jesus Christ to these kids by treating them right when they come here and not being jealous of them. And anyways, it was just a few nights ago. It was this week, I believe. We were sitting down at dinner and Abigail tapped me on the shoulder and she wanted to whisper something to me. And just to give you a little backstory to this, Abigail can be a little stingy when it comes to her toys, okay? And she's probably the most stingy when it comes to her coloring books, although Shelly and I haven't quite figured that out because she doesn't color a whole lot. I mean, she does a little bit, but she's really stingy about her coloring books, and she does not like to share them. And anyway, she taps me on the shoulder, and I lean over, and she whispers in my ear, and she said, Daddy, she said, Arian and Emery have been coloring in my coloring books all day. And then she paused, and she said, I'm really letting Jesus shine through me, aren't I? You see, what Abby said at dinner about Jesus, when I first told Abby that we needed to do some more self-sacrificing in the name of Jesus Christ, it was kind of like setting these 2 different plates in front of her, and one with that big helping of chocolate cake with all the globs of frosting that's on it that looks so appetizing, and the other that I put in front of her that I told her you should probably choose this one probably looked a little more like a couple of pieces of broccoli that didn't even have any ranch to dip it in, sitting on a little plate there. And then I told her that the right thing to do was to eat the one that didn't look appetizing and to ignore the cake. Now, she wanted to eat the cake. We all want to eat the cake. But she chose to eat the broccoli instead. And even at 6 years old, she recognized that feeling, that filling feeling inside of Jesus Christ and how living His legacy is so much more impactful than trying to create our own. She was excited that Christ was using her to help mend the broken hearts of someone else. Now, no one ever said that Christianity was easy. In fact, Jesus Himself said that you must take up your cross and follow Him. That indicates some serious self-sacrifice, all for the cause of righteousness. And many times we have to make hard decisions. I'm facing one right now in my life, but again, we have to look at it from the perspective of our faith and living out a life of righteousness and never giving in and putting Jesus on the back burner. And as we continue through the Sermon on the Mount and our study of the entire Gospel of Matthew, we will see that some things are required of us as Christians and things that will take a conscious effort of constant work on our part. But Christ has opened our eyes to the two spiritual plates that are setting before us this morning. And He's also opened our eyes to how we need to feed our spiritual hunger. And He's telling us to choose for ourselves. So will you pick the legacy that the world is going to long forget? The one that'll never fill you up. The one that'll be gone someday. Will you hold on to those trophies that will eventually end up in the dumpster when somebody doesn't even know who the heck you are and they decide to throw it out and redo the library? Or will you hunger and thirst for that righteousness of Christ and share in the eternal legacy of the one whom the Bible says that His throne will be established before the Lord forever? His legacy will never end. It's eternal. And we can share in that as the only legacy that we will have that is truly lasting. If you would stand with us this morning, our closing hymn will be number 156.